In 326 BC, the armies of Alexander the Great marched into the foothills of what is now northern Pakistan. They were exhausted, far from home, and fighting against a formidable Indian king named Porus. But as they rested, the soldiers noticed something strange. Their horses had stopped marching. They were on their knees, licking the rocks. When the men tasted the stones themselves, they discovered a substance that was simultaneously ordinary and extraordinary. Rock salt. A substance so fundamental to life that without it, our bodies would simply cease to function. The only rock that humans eat. For thousands of years, this white mineral was worth its weight in gold. It built empires, launched wars, and sparked revolutions. It was the foundation of the first great monopolies, the engine of global trade long before silk or spices, and the silent partner in the rise of nearly every major civilization on Earth. Today, you can buy a kilogram of salt for less than the price of a cup of coffee. It is so cheap, so abundant, that we have forgotten what it truly is. We have forgotten that this humble substance was once the most sought-after commodity in human history. This is the story of salt. The story begins over 8,000 years ago. Long before the first cities rose from the earth, early humans were already searching for salt. The oldest known salt production sites in Europe, where salt was extracted from saline springs, can be traced back to the 6th millennium BC. In the area of present-day Romania, archaeologists have found evidence of people boiling spring water to extract salt as early as 6000 BC. In China, evidence of salt mining dates from as early as 2000 BC. The first known Chinese treatise on pharmacology, written over 4,700 years ago, lists more than 40 different types of salt. The city of Jericho, one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in the world, was founded almost 10,000 years ago as a salt trading center. But why were these ancient peoples so desperate to find it? The answer is simple. Salt is essential for life. Our bodies cannot produce it on their own. We must consume it to survive. When humans transitioned from a nomadic hunter-gatherer lifestyle to agricultural communities, they no longer got enough salt from their diet of meat and blood. They needed to find it. And they needed a lot of it. Not just to eat, but to preserve food. In a world without refrigeration, salt was the only way to keep meat and fish from rotting during long winters. This ability to preserve food was the key to surviving harsh seasons and traveling long distances. Without salt, civilization as we know it would not exist. Salt making in history was regarded as a quasi-agricultural occupation. It was seasonal, beginning with the advent of warm weather or the spring high tide and ceasing with the onset of autumnal rains. People across the ancient world developed ingenious methods to obtain it. They evaporated seawater using the heat of the sun. They boiled water from brine springs. They mined rock salt from deep within the earth. By 5000 BC, the ancient Egyptians were using salt in their religious offerings. They also used it for mummification. A naturally occurring salt called natron, found in the desert west of the Nile Delta, was used as a desiccant in the mummification process. Without salt, the great pharaohs would not have been preserved for eternity. The ancient Greeks and Romans mixed salt with their sacrificial cakes. Homer called salt a divine substance. Plato described it as especially dear to the gods. Salt was considered a commodity essentially bound to the sea. In China, control of salt production began as early as the 7th century BCE, when emperors established the world's oldest state monopoly over its trade. The state of Qi, located on the Shandong Peninsula, maintained full state coffers with a monopoly of sea salt production starting around 685 BC. By the 3rd to 5th centuries AD, salt accounted for 80 to 90% of state revenues in some of the kingdoms established after the Han Dynasty collapsed. The ancient Chinese character for salt symbolizes how governments for centuries had seen salt as a source of state revenue and how they controlled its manufacture. Salt built the Great Wall of China. It funded armies and allowed emperors to project power across their vast territories. Salt was so valuable it was used as currency. In ancient Rome, soldiers were often paid in salt. The Latin word for salt is sal. From this, we get the word salarium, which meant salt money. And from salarium, we get the English word salary. The expression to be worth one salt meant that an individual was competent and deserved to be paid what they earned. Pliny the Elder, the famous Roman historian, recorded that Roman soldiers were often paid in salt. Producing this precious commodity was backbreaking, dangerous work. The earliest known salt mine in Europe was in Hallstatt, Austria, where salt was mined as early as 5000 BC. The Hallstatt mine is one of the most prominent archaeological sites in Austria, and it has given its name to the Hallstatt period of human civilization, which lasted from 800 to 400 BC. But mining salt in the ancient world was one of the most dangerous jobs imaginable. The salt dust in the air caused rapid dehydration. The work was often done by slaves or prisoners whose life expectancy was tragically low. The prehistoric salt mine of Hallstatt has preserved implements, parts of clothing, and even the bodies of the miners themselves, perfectly preserved by the salt. In China, by about 200 AD, people drilling for salt water discovered natural gas and used it to boil the brine. This was the world's first industrial use of natural gas. The ingenuity that went into salt making led to drilling techniques that would later give rise to the age of petroleum. And salt traveled. It moved along specially built salt roads. It crossed the Mediterranean Sea. And it traveled in massive camel caravans across the Sahara Desert. The quest for salt led to the development of major trade routes in the ancient world. The historian Herodotus described caravans heading for the salt oases of Libya. Great caravan routes stretched across the Sahara, as salt from the desert was an important commodity exchanged for West African gold and slaves. The trans-Saharan salt and gold trade, which flourished between the 6th and 16th centuries, was directly responsible for seismic shifts in African economies and the foundation of new empires. Salt from the desert was exchanged for gold from the Malian mines. The salt of Tagaza, a major salient in the western Sahara, was the source of Kantar upon Kantar of gold. The city of Venice, sitting in the shallow waters of the Adriatic lagoons, built its entire fortune on a monopoly of salt. For hundreds of years, Venice enjoyed a monopoly of this indispensable table commodity. The salt trade added to the fortunes of Venice. In every instance where a treaty was made with a foreign power, a clause was introduced reserving to Venice the right to control the salt trade. Salt revenues financed the military effort of the Republic in Italy and against the Turks. Salt made Venice the queen of the seas. Because salt was an absolute necessity, governments realized they could tax it. And they did so ruthlessly. In China, the salt monopoly was a pillar of state power for centuries. The monopoly system established during the Han Dynasty was a key component in the Chinese government's financial toolkit. Salt, with its highly localized and large-scale production, was an ideal target for bureaucratic management. The trade was highly corrupt. Elite salt merchants were selected and authorized to collect taxes on salt. They made a bundle and became rich. The famous gardens of Suzhou were built by salt merchant families. In France, the salt tax was known as la gabelle. It was one of the most burdensome and unpopular levies of the Ancien regime. In 1341, King Philip VI established the first permanent royal tax on salt. The government obliged every individual above the age of 8 years to buy a weekly minimum amount of salt at a fixed price. By 1789, when the revolution started, the salt tax made up nearly a quarter of royal revenues. The area around Paris was called Pays des Grandes Gabelles, or country of high salt tax. Salt in the Paris region sold for as much as 10 times its actual cost. The salt tax was a direct cause of the French Revolution. It fostered the smuggling and bootlegging of salt. Riots spread across France between 1750 and 1789, and they were more likely to occur around the salt tax borders. Moving from a low tax area to a high tax area increased the number of riots by 68%. Municipalities with higher salt taxes submitted more complaints about taxation in the list of grievances collected by the king in spring 1789. Legislators from areas with higher salt taxes were more likely to advocate for the end of the monarchy. The most famous act of resistance against a salt tax came in the 20th century. In 1930, the British Empire held a monopoly over salt production in India and imposed a heavy tax on it. Indian protests against the salt tax had begun in the 19th century. But in early 1930, Mohandas Gandhi decided to mount a highly visible demonstration against the increasingly repressive salt tax. He marched through what is now the western Indian state of Gujarat from his religious retreat at Sabarmati to the town of Dandi on the Arabian Sea coast. He set out on foot on March 12, 1930, accompanied by several dozen followers. After each day's march, the group stopped in a different village, where increasingly larger crowds would gather to hear Gandhi protest the unfairness of the tax on poor people. Hundreds more would join the core group. On April 6, 1930, Gandhi lifted a fistful of clayey mud embedded with salt crystals from the sea at Dandi. This act of civil disobedience, known as the Salt March or Dandi March, was the first act in an even larger campaign of civil disobedience. It garnered Gandhi widespread support among the Indian populace and considerable worldwide attention. It was a turning point in bringing the injustice of British rule to the attention of the wider world. The march began the overthrow of British rule in India. Salt had become a tool of oppression. But the people, with nothing more than the ocean and the sun, proved that even the mightiest empire could not control the wind and the waves. The 19th century changed everything for salt. The Industrial Revolution transformed salt production and created not only an increased demand for salt for its traditional food-related uses but also a rapidly increased demand from a salt-based chemical industry. New technologies, like steam power and advanced drilling, allowed for massive production. The price of salt plummeted. It was no longer a luxury for the elite but a staple for the masses. This was also the beginning of the chemical era for salt. Scientists unlocked its secrets. They discovered that salt was not just a seasoning or a preservative. It was a chemical building block. In the 1770s, the first use of salt as an industrial chemical came with the manufacture on Tyneside of hydrochloric acid from salt and sulfuric acid. The hydrochloric acid proved to be superior to sulfuric acid as a textile bleaching agent. By the end of the 18th century, salt had become firmly established as an industrial chemical. In 1791, French chemist Nicolas Leblanc patented a process for the production of alkali from salt. His process formed the basis of the 19th century alkali industry. Salt became the raw material for an astonishing range of products. Electrolysis of salt water produces chlorine and sodium hydroxide. Chlorine is used to purify drinking water and make plastics like PVC. Sodium hydroxide is used to make soap, paper, and aluminum. The repeal of the salt tax in Britain in 1825 stimulated a massive growth of alkali making on Merseyside, near to the supply of salt. Industrial salt for the alkali makers was drawn from the pans after 1 or 2 days. Salt production reached its height. Salt revenues funded some of the greatest public works in history, including the Erie Canal in the United States. Salt built cities. Salt has provoked and financed wars. It has been a strategic element in wars, such as the American Revolution and the Civil War. Today, only about 2% of the salt produced globally is for human and animal consumption. 10 times as much salt is used for de-icing roads in winter. Salt is essential for the chemical industry, the production of glass, aluminum, and synthetic materials. It is used in the manufacture of thousands of everyday items. Salt is no longer a symbol of wealth. It is a silent, invisible workhorse of the modern world. The story of salt is the story of civilization itself. It encompasses fields as disparate as engineering, religion, and food. Salt has often been considered so valuable that it served as currency. It is still exchanged as such in places today. Salt is recognized as a symbol for friendship, hospitality, chastity, alliance, table fellowship, fidelity, fertility, blessing, curse, and endurance. A pact of friendship was sealed with the gift of salt. In Iran, unfaithful to salt referred to ungrateful or disloyal individuals. In the Orient, salt was regarded as the symbol of a bond between parties eating together. The English word salary is derived from salarium, the Latin word for salt, which was the pay of Roman soldiers. Roman sausages were called salsus because so much salt was used to make them. Salt's story has a dark side as well. The quest for salt was built on the backs of slaves and the labor of prisoners. The salt taxes crushed the poor and sparked revolutions. And today, while we no longer fight over it, we face a new kind of conflict. A battle with the excess of salt itself. The deliberate and often well-camouflaged addition of salt to processed foods has momentous health consequences, comparable in nature to the well-documented risks of smoking tobacco. The food industry opposes the now overwhelming evidence that relates salt to a great number of deaths throughout the world. Today, there is an ongoing discussion about whether the currently high salt intake in Western societies is innocuous or detrimental. A battle that our ancestors, who struggled to find just a few precious grains, could never have imagined. Salt. The white gold that built the world. The only rock we eat. A story that is far from over.